And Cindy Mataraso. Cindy manages disaster mental health for the Red Cross and is Director of Clinical and Behavioral Services for Crestwood Behavioral Health in Sacramento. Her specialty, among several, is trauma-informed care. It's one of her clinical interests, and she treasures evidence-based care and best practices, and lets those guide her clinical work. Brianna and Cindy will be doing a presentation today on ways we can stay emotionally sound and we can build our own resilience, which we would need as our response to a disaster here, just as a resident, but also if we want to be helpers. So I'm going to turn it over to Brianna and Cindy, and thank you very much for coming and for participating with this vital information.
Well, thank you so much, Fran. Let me bring this up. I want to thank you for having the Red Cross back again to speak with all of you. And I also, as Fran said, you know, the key word is resilience.
Please note that only Brianna Taylor's discussion of mental health workers is included here as an introduction to Cindy Mataraso's presentation.
Health interventions. They help other disaster responders manage their stress while they're working in the disaster environment in consultation with the Red Cross leadership. Because if somebody's having a really difficult time, we might need to remove them from the response so they can take care of their own personal needs. And we're available to assist in all types of responses. And here you can see, this was during the wildfires, one of our disaster mental health having a conversation with one of our evacuees in the shelter. So I just wanted to make sure that you understand that disaster mental health is not psychotherapy, and it's not formal mental health evaluations or diagnoses. It's not individual psychological briefings about people, and it's not long-term therapy, trauma therapy. And that's because we only see people on a short-term basis. And building strong therapeutic alliances is not appropriate during a disaster. And some interventions have concerns about efficacy or secondary trauma. And the lack of pre-screening can really be problematic. So some of the factors that affect disaster responders specifically. Working in unfamiliar and challenging settings. It's very hard to be out there at times, seeing the things that you're seeing, and it can be very challenging. We know what the smoke was like during the wildfires last fall, and to be out there in that kind of setting. Many times I would go to my car during the wildfires in the last several years, come out to my car and it would be covered with ash as I would go to the job headquarters. You're also encountering unfamiliar cultural or ethnic populations, which you may not be used to serving, and that can be very stressful. Listening to survivor stories over and over again because they need to tell them over and over again. Seeing disturbing sights. And for responders who travel to a disaster, they leave their families at home and their loved ones to go to the assignment. And so they're there by themselves dealing with everything. Then they return home and there's no way that their families can possibly understand what they've been through during their 2-week deployment or longer. And even now for responders who work virtually, because about 2/3 of our volunteers are working virtually right now. We're working from home, but we're at home, but we're not at home. So you can be at home with the doors closed, but you're not available to your family members. So that can be very stressful. They don't understand. And working from home, somehow you can't get away from the work. It's not like you're leaving the site because you're there where you're always working. So these are factors that really affect our disaster responders that you don't think about. But we're all in this together. And so at this point, what I want to do is turn it over to Cindy, who's going to talk to you more about taking care of yourself so that you can also help take care of those others that you love. So I want to thank you for kind of giving you an overview and putting this in context. So I can turn it over to Cindy at this point. And thank you, Cindy, for being here. Okay, I will stop sharing.
All right. Thank you so very much, Brianna. We are so glad that you were able to get time away from your deployment. We appreciate it. And I want to thank Fran and Harris and the entire EPO team. And most importantly, to all of you who are here. It is so exciting to see the amount of energy and engagement that Rossmore has to prepare for an emergency. I have not been involved with the Red Cross nearly as long as Brianna, so I appreciate your overview. My commitment to getting community readiness happened about 8 years ago. By that time, I had already been in community mental health and had much for your service. CERT is another amazing group. As natural disasters in California became increasingly more intense and closer together, we now have fires and disasters that are happening in December. I saw firsthand that communities and individuals were coming together and they were preparing more. People were preparing their go bags and families were having their plans. That's when I decided to start to volunteer with the American Red Cross. And I am in the disaster mental health team. And so I have the honor of being able to support and serve our first responders, our DAT teams, those that are on the front lines, as well as those that are going through a disaster. So Brianna did a great job at describing to you what it looks like when there is a disaster and people get displaced. I cannot overestimate enough the impact that this has on workers. People that are responding are hugely impacted. It impacts their mental health. It impacts their well-being. As Brianna stated, people are away from home or they are at home, but people are absorbing the sounds. So if you're in a fire site, you're absorbing the sounds of crackling trees, the sights, the smells. All of this has a huge impact on somebody's emotional well-being. So as a disaster mental health worker, I am part of a team that when people come back from a deployment, we're checking in with our workers because we know how much they have been impacted. And we are reminding them and connecting with them, allowing them to tell their stories because telling their stories is important. And we're reminding them of their resilience plan. So I'm going to teach you some of the steps that the American Red Cross has come up with to help both those that respond to disasters, but also those that are going through it. By practicing these steps here today, you will be better prepared to help others during a disaster and also to help yourself. Because what you will be doing is you are going to be bolstering your well-being. All right, so what is today about? What today is about is information that largely comes from Red Cross's course called Psychological First Aid. Psychological first aid is the practice of recognizing and responding to people who are experiencing disaster-related stress, including those that are loved ones, neighbors. As Brianna said, you might come home from a disaster and your family members don't know what you have been through. They can't imagine. People that are going through a disaster who reach out to their loved ones. they might have a hard time understanding. And so psychological first aid allows for that first response for somebody to have a compassionate environment where they can start to process and get grounded to be able to help themselves and be able to manage the impact of the disaster. The information that you will learn today, you'll be able to provide some immediate support and be able to manage stressful situations. All right, and where does it all start? It all starts with you. We are our best buffer for managing and dealing with emergencies. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some terms. First, we're going to talk about your stress response. There's a researcher, Peter Levine, who has coined the term window of tolerance. This is our set point for where we can manage stress optimally. This point kind of ebbs and flows as we go throughout the everyday stressors of our lives. In our window of tolerance, or where our set point is, we can manage things like traffic jams, our phone going off in the middle of a Zoom conversation. We can handle tensions with loved ones. We're able to grab on to our coping skills for the ways that we resolve or we problem solve things, and just have a smooth flow through these experiences. That is our window of tolerance. However, life often throws us curveballs, or our window of tolerance, we get pushed to the edges, or sometimes we even pop out of our window of tolerance. When that happens, our body goes into a natural preservation mode. You may have heard of this as the fight, flight, or freeze. But basically, you are out of that set point, out of your window of tolerance, where your coping mechanisms are taxed, where things are overwhelming. You might even feel threatened. When you get knocked out of your window of tolerance, it has an impact on every part of your body. You experience emotional distress. Your body will go into a response where you will have more cortisol that is being released, where it will impact your perceptions, it impacts your thoughts, and it actually impacts all of your senses, the way you take in visual information, the way you hear things or see things. So you can be greatly impacted on how you just operate and experience the events that are going around you. When you get knocked out of your window of tolerance, it's a biological response. It is not something that you're going to sit on an hour Zoom and hear how to conquer. It is not something that you can overcome by training or life experience. Whether you have been a first responder in your life, or whether you have worked on personal wellness and resilience, that fight or flight response is a biological response. It happens to everybody. That's one of the reasons why the Red Cross realized how important it is to take care of those people that are responding to disasters. And by knowing this stress response, you can better take care of yourself and you can better take care of others during a disaster. All right, so we will go over the fight, flight, or freeze response a little bit later on. But now I want to move on to psychological resilience. Psychological resilience is the ability to bounce back from stressful situations, even in a crisis. Many things impact your resilience. Resilience is something that can be strengthened. It is something that can be built. It is something that as you experience the ebbs and flows, the ups and downs, the positives and negatives of life, that you can build upon that. The things that you're going to learn today, you probably have already used. It's probably not going to be anything new. Being able to talk about it and think about it as resilience is going to help you to be able to use it during a disaster, and is going to be able to help you better pull that out of those that you are working with during a disaster. Resilience plays a critical role in facing our everyday stresses, the daily hassles of life. Something that we have all experienced, that we all can relate to, is a traffic jam. So maybe not now so much with COVID, but in the past, I am sure that we have all been in a traffic jam in this lovely Bay Area of ours, where we were late for an appointment, right? In that moment of time, you got stressed, but your resilience allowed you to manage that stress. You probably use skills like keeping things in perspective. You avoided thinking about the situation as something that was insurmountable. And you probably made an action plan and then acted on those. Each one of those things is resilience. So keeping things in perspective allows you to realize that being in a traffic jam is annoying and you don't want to be late for your appointment, but you actually are going to be. By doing this, you avoid thinking about this as an all or nothing situation and making it larger than it needed to be. Because you were able to do that, you probably could come up with some next steps that you could do right there in the moment. Maybe use your speakerphone to reach out to the place that you were going to be late to, let them know, find out if the appointment could be rescheduled, or perhaps even started while you were in the traffic. All of those steps are resilience. And all of those steps, even though you may never have been in a disaster before, you can use those skills when you move into a disaster or when you're helping someone when they're in a disaster. But people don't often recognize that they have these skills, that they have the resilience to manage these situations, these disaster situations where they are overwhelmed, where they have incredible loss, where they have grief, and their lives have been tremendously disruptive. So let me give you an example of how disaster mental health works, and something that you certainly can do when you are working with others. So I recently was working with a family, and there were two children in the family, a 17-year-old and a 9-year-old. The mother was concerned about her 9-year-old. This family was displaced. They were living in a motel room. They had had a kitchen fire, but their house was not livable, at least for a short period of time. So they were living in this one room in a motel room, and the 9-year-old was experiencing a lot of distress. And so the mother and I did some talking. I first tended to the mother and I tapped into her resilience. I gave her lots of validation for the situation that she was in. And then we talked about her daughter, which was causing her lots of distress. It turns out her daughter was quite resourceful, but her daughter wasn't able to do the things that she liked doing: coloring, reading, listening to her music. In talking with her mom, she realized that her daughter was very attached to a beanbag chair that the daughter has in her room. And that's often where she would do a lot of these de-stressing activities. The mother was actually able to go back into the house, get the beanbag chair, bring it to the motel room. And although the room was quite small, it helped the daughter quite a bit. That beanbag chair, something that was comforting, something that was part of the daughter's routine and habit of wellness, allowed the mother to more easily coach the daughter to do some of those things that help the daughter to de-escalate a little bit. The mother and I also spoke quite a bit about how to keep her kids connected with routines. Routines are very important, and where you can to help yourself and others maintain those routines. It might be watching a show together that you all used to do before you were displaced. It might be a certain meal. It might be connecting with a community group, but routines can be tremendously comforting. Okay, now moving on. How do we build some of these resilience skills? These 10 things that I'm going to go over are not the only ways to build resilience. These are things that the Red Cross has developed for psychological first aid. They are things that you can use and things that you can help the people that you are working with at the time. But these are by no means an exhaustive list of resilience. Everybody has resilience. Everybody has the ability to build upon the resilience. So the first thing to do is to think about making connections with others. People have natural supports. These natural supports might be the obvious: family, neighbors, friends, but they also might be the less obvious. They also might be things like a hobby that somebody was involved in. For the family that I just mentioned, her and her daughters did hula dancing. And although she would not have identified the people in her hula dancing group as resources, she did re-engage with that activity with her daughters, and it was tremendously helpful. So think about where it is appropriate to use those natural resources to get people connected and or reconnected. Another thing about connections is people might want to get connected with things that they are not typically connected with. I sometimes see this where people want to get connected with their religion, with somebody in a spiritual faith-based community, when that's not something that they usually did in their daily routine. So think about other places that might be natural places of connection, even though the person may not already have an established relationship there. There are many, many places to get people connected with spiritual care. There are spiritual care providers that are connected with fire departments, with the Red Cross, and certainly our religious organizations in our community are available to reach out to people in disasters as well. Help somebody avoid seeing a crisis as insurmountable, while at the same time, people have experienced tremendous loss in a disaster. They might be very disoriented, dysregulated, living in different places. Helping somebody to find those parts of the disaster or the emergency that can be managed can help them to translate that and generalize that to other parts of the situation. Help somebody not to see it as impacting their entire life. Sometimes I might ask people to tell me about other aspects of their life, things that were not impacted by the disaster. I do this not to minimize anybody's experience, because we certainly don't want to do that, but to help somebody to get connected and see that there's still balance and that they can work to repair and put their lives back together. One way in doing that is through acceptance. And of course, accepting things like the loss of a home, a loss of a community, is a tremendous thing to accept. The loss is real, the grief is real, people are overwhelmed. And if people can accept that change is a part of life, accept what has happened in the disaster, then they can move into a place of problem solving or developing goals. Because somebody accepts an emergency, a disaster, a loss in their community, it does not mean that they like it, that they agree with it, or that grieving isn't needed. The grieving part is distinctly separate and different from accepting that that a disaster has happened. Again, if you can accept the disaster, if you can accept the loss, the person can move through a place of grief and can move through decision making and putting goals in place that will help them to put their life back together. Sometimes when I'm helping people with goals, you have to break things down. It can be way too much to look at a disaster, a loss of a home, and try to put the whole thing together at once. So I really work with people to put things into categories or to organize it in ways that are manageable. Some people have resources that allow them to look at the big picture and be able to do lots of things at once. And some people need to look at smaller pieces. That's part of what I'm doing with someone when I am working with them during a disaster, is helping to make things manageable for them. So for the family that I mentioned earlier, we had to break things down into small parts. When the mom was working with her children around the relocation and how that impacted their daily life, she was doing that and only that. When she moved into dealing with her house and the repairs of her house, we put a list together and she bit off of that list what she felt was manageable. It is then very important to take those decisive steps and to take action. But just because you know what to do doesn't mean that you can do it. So someone might know what to do, but not have the internal or external resources to do that. So sometimes problem solving is needed to help somebody. Maybe someone needs to be connected with a resource in their community. Maybe someone needs to jump over the hurdle and dive into insurance or putting their family back together. It is important to recognize what resources somebody needs to put those goals into action, and not just assume that if somebody has goals that they are able to take those action steps. You can build upon people's previous resilience. People have been through challenging situations. People have managed hard times in their life. Sometimes talking about what got them through is going to give you some insight into how you might be able to help them, what resources you might be able to direct them to, what resilience they already have that they can build upon. Okay. We can also help somebody look at the higher meaning. Again, you don't want to do this in a way that is minimizing of people's experience. You don't want to say things like, what doesn't kill you is going to make you stronger. But if people start to give you experiences in their past about how challenges have helped them in their future, to be more appreciative of their communities, to have more gratitude, you can start to make those connections in this situation as well. It is many, many times that people will get through a disaster and they will feel more connected to humanity, to their friends and family, to their community. People often have tremendous gratitude for those that have helped them and will want to pay that forward and become helpers in the future. People often will come through emotional distress and have an increased sense of self-worth or have a more developed sense of spirituality or heightened appreciation. Sometimes when I'm working with people and they have a sense of just being so overwhelmed, I might look for things that they're telling me in our conversation, for things that they're grateful for. And I might ask them questions about that, because through that gratitude, people might be able to get to a place of self-discovery or of appreciation, one of connection, where then they are able to work and be able to more effectively work on some of the things that are needed to manage the disaster and to help those around them. Nurturing a positive view of yourself can be very challenging when you are overwhelmed, when you have lost your home, when you're possibly displaced or living in a shelter. Finding where you are resilient, finding where you are meeting the demands of a situation can be very challenging for people. That is where you come in. Having conversations with people, providing that compassionate environment, that compassionate conversation, you can help people to identify and nurture their sense of efficiency, of effectiveness, of where they are managing a tremendously challenging situation in effective ways. I will often point out to people that when people experience a disaster, that doing everyday tasks is tremendously more challenging. I think we could all think about for ourselves at the beginning of COVID, just going to the grocery store required an incredible amount of energy, where in the past, it might have been something that we did habitually and didn't give it much thought. Help people to try to keep things in perspective. Again, we do this in a kind, nurturing way and in a way that does not minimize the situation. Keeping a perspective can allow people to look at things and be able to put goals into place and to take action items. I will sometimes ask people about different situations that are happening, just to be able to help them to get a bigger perspective. I might ask them about their pets and ways that they are caring for their pets, or the ways that they are managing meals, small things, but it helps to keep some perspective. I also help people to keep perspective, and you can help people to keep perspective by honing in on relationships. Often at times of loss, people might want to put their lives back together, re-engage with their homes, their living situations. This is tremendously important, but it's also very important for people to be able to care for themselves and their loved ones. So sometimes pointing that out and asking people specific questions about how they're sleeping, if they're finding time, if they have a pet, if they're finding time to be with their pet or be with their loved ones, might connect people back to that perspective of family and relationships. As much as possible, help people to maintain a hopeful outlook. And this can be tremendously challenging, but an optimistic outlook can enable the unexpected to happen. I'm going to give you an example of somebody that I worked with over the summer. He was an elderly gentleman, and he had a fire. I think it was in his walls. It destroyed his whole house. And so he was displaced from his house. He was elderly. The years prior to this fire, he had experienced some financial hardship. And so maintenance of his house had gone onto the back burner, as well as home insurance. So he had no insurance for his home. He also had to give up his car because he could no longer afford his car. So here was this elderly gentleman whose home was not livable, and he did not have the money to repair it. He was immediately connected with spiritual care, with the firefighters in the community that were helping him. Red Cross was involved in the case. The gentleman had no resources, and so Red Cross jumped in, and a DAT worker got him connected with housing and food and basic needs. And they called in disaster mental health, and I got assigned the case. This gentleman's hope and optimism was absolutely remarkable. In spite of his tremendous loss, having no insurance, having no what seemed to be natural resources, he was still able to find positivity, gratitude, appreciation for his bicycle. In fact, he was so remarkable that the spiritual care provider through the fire department asked the local news station to do a human interest story on him. And yes, he got money and donations, but the most amazing thing that he got was a reconnection with a sister that he hadn't seen in decades. And they reconnected, and she became a resource for him. And it was his hopefulness and outlook that allowed that to happen. So I think I will always remember that story because it does give a great example of how when you can manage that hopefulness, that the unexpected can happen. All right, so here we have taking care of yourself. Taking care of yourself might be the most important thing. So it's number 10, and it's number 10 because if you only remember one thing, remember this last thing. Taking care of yourself allows you to take care of others. We probably all have routines of wellness or self-care, exercise, eating right, doing things like journaling, belonging to our book clubs. All of these things allow us to have a rich, fulfilled life where we maintain our balance. These things allow us to have a very robust window of tolerance. They are all very important. Taking care of yourself during a disaster is something that is a little bit different. It might not be feasible for you to go on a run or to exercise if the air is full of smoke. You might not have the energy to go to your book club. So what does taking care of yourself look like in disaster, in an emergency? It takes very little energy, and there are things that you can do even when you are with people, even when you are in conversation with someone, to take care of yourself. Things as simple as taking deep breaths. Oftentimes when people get stressed or overwhelmed, they will take very shallow breaths, and this will actually make people feel more overwhelmed and more anxious. So I will sometimes myself take deep breaths if I'm noticing that I am getting overwhelmed with a situation. But it's also very common that when I'm talking to someone and I notice that they have a very rapid pace of speaking and very shallow breaths, that I might find an organic way of saying, can we just take some deep breaths together, and give them some education on why it is important to take deep breaths. I often will give people a visual around taking deep breaths. So if you are somebody that wants a little guide, how do I know if a breath is deep or if a breath is shallow? With a deep breath, your chest and your stomach is going to rise and fall. You can breathe in as if you are smelling roses, and you can exhale as if you are blowing out candles. That's a pretty good guide for deep breaths. Helping someone to do 3 deep breaths can have a surprisingly tremendous impact on their well-being and helping people to get a little bit more present in a situation. Okay, so I just want to stay here just for one moment. We went through 10 different ways in which the Red Cross has identified resilience. Those 10 ways are good whether you are a first responder, somebody who goes out to help support the aftermath of an emergency, or somebody who is themselves being impacted by an emergency. So I hope that you found some skills in there, some resilient skills that you currently use and that you can build upon, you can think of as resilience and purposefully use them in times of stress and crisis. And maybe you learned 1 or 2 that you didn't think of as resilience, or 1 or 2 that you want to build on. Okay, so I'm now going to move into that fight, flight, or freeze, that stress response. So what is stress? So we all have that natural set point that I talked about, that window of tolerance. I'm going to talk a little bit about when we bump up to the top of that window of tolerance, or even when we get bumped out of that window of tolerance. What happens when we go into fight, flight, or freeze? It's a biological effect. We cannot control it. So again, it doesn't matter what your training is. It doesn't matter how many deployments you've been on. Your body is still going to go into fight, flight, or freeze. So just like when you eat food, you cannot control your body from not digesting that food. It is the same for fight, flight, or freeze. But what you can do is you can learn to recognize those stress responses that you have in yourself so that you can use some of the resilience that we just learned about and that you can teach others. Okay, so let me see here. So stress responses are unique. Every individual will have a different stress response. And to make things even more confusing, one person might have a different stress response to the exact same situation, but it's under different conditions or circumstances. So we respond the way we respond, and all sorts of things impact that. Things like our age, our gender, whether we're married, whether we're single, the nature of the crisis, even how tired we are when the situation occurs. We also will have a very different response to natural disasters versus man-made events. And the type of experience that we have actually impacts other things, which impacts other stress response. So it's a little bit of a ripple effect. It's like dominoes toppling over. For instance, people tend to respond worse during disasters that happen in the evening. But in the evening, families are typically together. And so that reduces stress after the disaster. Whereas people tend to respond better to disasters that happen during the day. But during the day, you might not be with your family. And so it could result in additional distress after the emergency because family members might be separated. So many things go into how you will respond to two different situations. Our individual stress reactions are unique, just like our stress responses are unique. But every single part of our functioning is impacted. So part of what I invite you to do is to notice what happens to your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors as that stress response goes into effect. Because by knowing when you are going into a stress response, you can take care of yourself. These things you can also teach to people that are going through a disaster. And oftentimes people will find it normalizing and comforting to know this type of information. Knowing this information can also help you to understand what somebody is going through. So somebody who typically might be very resilient might not be very resilient immediately following a crisis. Somebody might have unusual behaviors, and it might be directly a response to the fight, flight, or freeze. So our feelings, they might get hyper focused on fear or hopelessness. People might experience terror. Other people might experience nothing and feel a numbness. When people have hyper-focused feelings, it's often a good indication that they are in a fight, flight, or freeze response. And again, those feelings can be any feeling, but the typical ones are fear, hopelessness, overwhelm, or numbness. People's thoughts can get very constricted. People can have a hyper focus on blaming or being forgetful. People might have lower self-esteem, or they might get a sense of blaming. But thoughts and thought processes might get impacted. People's ability to problem solve is probably impaired right after a crisis. And you wouldn't want to problem solve with somebody except for when it was absolutely needed until a little time has been since the disaster. So somebody can have opportunity to have that initial response and start to settle their body and these effects. People will often experience tremendous physical fatigue. They might have changes in their sleep and in their eating. I will often educate people to this. Again, it is normalizing when we educate people to these different physical responses. And in doing that, people can often start to problem solve themselves. It is also very validating to give people permission, and they can give themselves permission, that knowing that disasters often come with fatigue, that they can give themselves that permission to sleep extra if they need it. Every human mind feels pleasure in doing good for another person. My way of saying thank you for the work that you're doing and for being here. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section. So what can you do? This is how you can be here for another person. Here are specific ways that you can assist people. First, you can create a compassionate environment. One of the values of the Red Cross, and also something that is tremendously healing for people who are going through a disaster. How do you create a compassionate environment? You take interest in the person, you listen, you hear their unique story, and you move through trying to help support them, direct them to their natural resources, to their resilience, and where needed, provide them with resources and provide them with support. If they need something that they don't have immediate access to, if we can help them with that, that is a way that you can provide immediate assistance. You can offer positive coping. Again, during times of loss, offering people validation for what they're going through will often help them come up with their own coping. You can explore with them where they have gone through these situations before and what has been helpful. Nurture those experiences and help them to use those skills here. All right, here are some guidelines when you are doing those things. First, we are tolerant of differences. We know that people come through disasters and emergencies with their own unique backgrounds, their own unique culture, their own unique ethnicities. We treat everybody with respect and with dignity, with the way that they look, the way that they talk, and the way that they dress. Sometimes this means that people will ask for something and you don't readily understand why they might need that thing. It might be because in their culture, it is something that provides comfort. And so I'm always looking for ways to connect people with their values, with their views and beliefs. And if something is going to be helpful, just like that young girl that I mentioned earlier and her purple beanbag chair, it is something that might provide comfort for the person. We keep our boundaries. We keep our boundaries. In these sorts of situations, you will often hear things and people will often share their personal experiences with you. Keep their information private. Respect people's information. Sometimes you might feel like what you are doing is not enough. Sometimes you might feel like you want to do more, and that just being there is not providing the support or help. Know when you yourself need to get support. If you are helping in a large disaster, you might lose sight of how important and validating it can be to give somebody an opportunity to tell their story, to connect somebody with a compassionate conversation and connect them with resources and to connect them with loved ones. If you are really feeling like somebody needs additional support, there are places to get support and to find that out. Some place like the Red Cross with disaster mental health, or even the Rossmore Counseling Center. And finally, taking care of yourself. Again, the common factor. We are the best tools during a disaster. One of the best ways that we keep our tool ourselves really honed and ready for a disaster is by having our routines of wellness, but also having routines of self-care during a time of disaster. So we talked about the deep breathing, but if that doesn't help, you can combine that with any number of things that help you or the other person to get present in the moment. It can be as simple as doing a little bounce on your feet. 3 deep breaths, bouncing on your feet, and doing a little self-talk. It might even be, I got this, will help you to get present. And by you taking care of yourself, it helps you to run the marathon that a disaster often requires. We typically can get through the short sprints of distress, but it's that marathon, it's the taking care of ourselves that allow us to do that marathon. I'm going to go over this one because I know that we're running up on time at this point. Here are some actions that you can take. Observe and be aware of what's going on around you and helping those people that are having a challenging time because maybe they're in a fight, flight, or freeze mode, to observe and be aware as well. For some people, when they're in fight, flight, or freeze, they might get hyper focused and they might not be able to take in the full environment visually. So we can help people with that. We can direct people if there's a safe place for them to go, or a place to get food or other resources. Don't assume that people see those things. Verbally tell them and make sure that they see them by pointing them out, and you watching that they are looking at those things. Make connections. Connect people straight away. Oftentimes with disasters, Red Cross is going to mobilize quickly, as is Rossmore and other resources. Make connections for people, not with just the things that can resource them, with getting their needs met, but also with their communities. If family members have been separated, try to get them back together. Help people to feel comfortable and at ease, and be calm and compassionate. Introducing yourself goes a long way. Telling people where you're at and that you want to help and that you're here to help can be very assuring to people. Validating what people are going through can be very comforting. We can assist people with basic needs. And again, a basic need might be something that you might not think of as a basic need. And so make sure that we are taking all requests into consideration. And how we really know what people need is because we listen to them. Listen to people compassionately and with kindness. When you are with somebody, only be with that one person. We can only do one thing at a time. If we are responding to a disaster, it takes many, many hands to be able to address all the needs. But ultimately, we are one person. And so when we are doing that one thing, to be present in doing that one thing. So give realistic reassurance. We don't want to give people false hope. We don't want to say things to them like everything is going to be okay, but accurately reflecting what they're going through. Saying to people, this is a very challenging time, or I like how you are giving your daughter a hug. Those are reassuring statements. There are people here to help. So make sure that what you are saying is realistic, is accurate, and is reassuring. I went through some of this, but I do want to just talk a little bit about ending the conversation. When you are stopping your conversation with somebody, make sure you let them know that it is ending. You want to say goodbye. You want to make sure that they know where they can get reconnected with others that can be helpful. So make sure that you close the conversation. So before you go in and help with a disaster, think through your strategies. What resources are you going to use? How are you going to methodically and purposefully go about your work, the tasks that you are called upon to help keep yourself as strong as possible, to tend to yourself, but then also tend to others? Take the time that you need to get oriented to the resources that are available. You need to know where you can take care of yourself, where you can have a few moments of quiet. You also need to know where you are directing people, what the scope of what you are expected to do is, and who your support people are. So take a moment for yourself to make sure that you are fully oriented to get ready. Half of knowledge is knowing where to get it. We live in the Bay Area, and there is lots of resources available to us. The Red Cross website is filled with resources and information. More and more of our training is going online. County mental health and mental health services are plentiful in the Bay Area, and we have plenty of people like the Red Cross, CERT, EPO that are ready for emergencies. And here are some specific referrals. You can suggest people go to their regular healthcare provider. Your Rossmore Counseling Center is a fantastic resource. Here is both the phone number and the website. NAMI, it stands for the National Alliance of Mental Illness, and they operate a warm line that is a phone number that people can call who are not in a crisis, but are in distress to get support. And then we have our Contra Costa crisis line. Both the warm line and the crisis line are 24/7 resources. So thank you very much.
Cindy, I want to thank you for an amazing presentation, very helpful. If I had to sum it up, I would say that your information connected to Brianna's information on mental health disaster work gives us some real skills and some real ideas on how to preserve and encourage agency. As a helper, I have control over some things in a disaster, and other things I have no control over. But I do have agency over some things. And if we can be here for our neighbors, for the folks we in our entries and on our streets that we're responsible for in terms of the EPO mission, then we can help them reestablish and encourage their own sense of agency in the middle of a area-wide, major disaster. This has been phenomenal. I want to thank you both, and both of you exhibit what I think is the best in disaster mental health. You obviously have mirror neurons, lots of empathy for the folks you're trying to help, be they helpers or be they our neighbors, our residents of Rossmore. I deeply appreciate it. We are going to go now to our questions. And before we do that, I want to just introduce Sharon Meckenstock. She is EPO's new designated director for mental health. She's here, and if there are questions directed to her, Sharon is happy to answer them. She has years of experience in public mental health. She has 11 years at Tulare County Mental Health, San Pablo Rape Crisis Center, and Contra Costa County's Public Guardian Program. Sharon knows a few things about resiliency. So, Christine, do we have any questions?
We do have a few questions. Thanks, Fran, and thanks to the panelists. This is so important to know about the resource of Red Cross. And one thing that I picked up is you can donate to the Red Cross and help these services continue. Not just blood, but money too, as well as time. So a couple questions. There are a number of questions. People have said this was a great presentation, and thanks so much for all the strategies. Recognizing that you're talking to coordinators who are probably going to be the first people that interact with our residents during an emergency, are there any specific trainings that Red Cross offers that would help coordinators? You gave a lot of good resources, but practice makes perfect or near perfect. So any sort of trainings that you have that could be useful to coordinators specifically? And that's to Brianna or Cindy.
So thank you very much for that question. And I love the forethought and getting ready for a disaster. This talk was largely taken from the skills that are in psychological first aid. That is a course that the Red Cross teaches. I believe, Brianna probably knows better, I believe at this point it is online, and that will allow you to get more familiar with these concepts. The more you are able to care for yourself, the more you're able to care for others. These skills allow you not only to manage the immediate disaster, but it also will help with the aftermath. It also will help reduce the amount of stress response and PTSD that you and other people experience from a disaster. So recognizing that the skills of providing the help are very important in how you organize that. Psychological first aid helps us get ready as individuals and brings our most resilient self to the situation.
Christine,
Thank you, Cindy. Go ahead.
Christine, I will send you a link to that class that anybody can go on.
Send
Okay.
send it also to me, Brianna, and
I will.
we'll make sure it gets on our website.
Okay.
For our coordinators. Great.
Perfect, perfect. Cindy, you mentioned the personal psychological boundaries. That's something that's really important here, because even on a good day, there are a lot of people in Rossmore who have a lot of needs that they sometimes can't deal with. And EPO coordinators sometimes end up stepping into that role and stepping and stepping and stepping until you really feel like you're the personal assistant for someone. So can you define what personal psychological boundary is, and maybe some strategies that some of our coordinators need to have to make sure that they don't become the personal assistants for 92 people?
Such a great question. That pull to keep stepping and stepping and stepping is great. Working with people in need is very rewarding, and needs are tremendous. So needs can feel like they are never ending. And it can be very hard if you can help somebody to not be able to help them. So I would say the personal psychological boundaries, it starts before you ever go in and offer support. It starts today. It is important that you know the purpose, the boundaries of what it is that you are doing. The work of a disaster requires everybody to do their part, and to make sure that you are aware of your part, where your job starts and where your job ends, can help you to keep those boundaries. I often experience this when I get called into a case, is knowing when to exit the case. Oftentimes, people's needs extend far beyond the needs of addressing a disaster. And so knowing when to resource somebody and connect them back to their natural supports and to politely exit is the role of what I am supposed to be doing. And so although I may need to call a colleague because it doesn't feel nice to leave somebody when they're still in need, that's what needs to happen, unless I would be stepping and stepping and stepping. Responding to a disaster is running a marathon. It is not sprinting, and it's not running more than a marathon. We each have our mile that we run. So know your mile, know what it is that you are doing, recognize that, and be able to step out when you need it.
And last of all, I mean, I think that's great, because boundaries are critical to do anything, to be effective. And as you said, if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of anyone else. So that's important for the coordinators here in Rossmore to recognize. Are there any sort of tip or summary sheets available? Here in Rossmore, we like to have little cheat sheets for everything. So we don't have to try to remember everything because sometimes memory fails us. But do you have any checklists or tip sheets that you could provide to us that would help a coordinator in an emergency?
Yes, I can pull some of the slides that are summary slides, including that last one that provides resources. Those can be pulled out and used.
That would be great.
And I also invite people that as you use them as a summary sheet, you can make your own notes on them. And so you can personalize them to what's going to help you the most. And that way you have it right there when you get called upon.
Great.
Thank you all. What a wonderful, amazing presentation. I used to teach college. My students will tell you I'm a hard grader. Excellent presentation. Thank you very much.